Hello and welcome. In this episode, we are going to talk about what's going on along the front lines in Ukraine. We are going to talk in length about the situation in Kherson, about news, current news, ongoing news about the mobilization, more political news from both sides of the war, and finally, more information about international support for each side. Before we start with the situation on the front line, just some general information that I've missed so far that I haven't reported. The Rasputitsa is now in full swing. That means, as far as I understand, the translation is more or less like the time of groundless roads or something. Basically, the mud period is now in full swing. Movement of anything but the most well-equipped equipment to go through mud is now more or less bound to paved roads. On the Eastern Front, the Russians are saying the Ukrainians attack along the whole front line between Svatove and Rubishne. We have some reports about attacks further as well here. The Russians are saying they defeated tons of attacks. The other side, there were likely Russian attacks in this area here towards from Bilohorivka more or less up to what is it called? Makivka. There also was likely a Russian attack in the direction of Karmasinivka to push the Ukrainians away from the front line. That was it, more or less, along the whole front line here, because while there have been reports about lots of attacks, there is no recorded change of hands, change of territory. So all those attacks were not leading to any serious result, which means it would lead me to just entertain you by saying Ukrainian names in a wrong way, which means I'm going to not waste both our times by trying to pronounce all the names. The Ukrainian side are still attacking here. There are some Russian counterattacks, but the front hasn't moved within the last 2 days. Further south, the Russians are trying with brute force now to gain the initiative and to push forward along the whole front line, more or less from Bilohorivka down to Vuhledar, which is here. Come here. And the channel mascot decided to come on my lap. The Ukrainian side is reporting up to 80 daily attacks. Lots of them are being performed with fresh mobilized draftees, mobilized, called up reserves. Again, here 80 attacks obviously makes it impossible or at least unreasonable to try to tell every single point of attack. The thing is, any reports, video evidence that we have show that they are suffering heavy losses, and the gains in territory seem to be negligible to non-existent. There have even been some reports of Ukrainian counterattacks, especially here in Pavlivka. The majority of the town seems to be back in Ukrainian hand, even though we have confirmed presence of the Russians on the southern side of the town. Generally, front isn't moving much while the Russians are attacking like absolute with high intensity. The question would be why the Russians are have been going in piecemeal over the last few weeks, and while they haven't massed troops for a massive attack to steamroll the Ukrainians, but that's a question I can't really answer to you, On the southern front, we have the usual artillery fire and cruise missile attack, bomb attacks, etc. Somewhat from both sides, we have reports of Ukrainian attacks in the direction of Melitopol. Supposedly some military targets hit there, but nothing really confirmed. And when it comes to the Russian side, the only remarkable thing that is different from the past was that for the first time in a while, I've heard reports about an Iskander missile being used by the Russian side here in this direction. The other thing is, the Ukrainians are saying the Russians used 8 drones for an attack against Dnipro, and they shot down each one of them. That should have been Shahed 136, which would now be an indication that the Ukrainians are successfully adapting to the threat. In Kherson, we have the usual reports about the usual attacks, which means lines of communication, logistics, command centers, troop concentrations, ferries, pontoon bridges, etc., ammunition dumps, and so on and so forth by the Ukrainians. But when it comes to the big news, the supposed withdrawal, it's still uncertain what's going on. A Russian news outlet said the Russian flag is just no longer flying up on top of the administration building because they've moved the administration for the oblast towards the Crimean Peninsula. So they relocated, which kind of makes sense both if you want to fight for it or if you don't. Because obviously an administration probably works better when it's not in a war zone, in a direct war zone. So that is not really any proof of anything, but there are reports that the VDV, so the paratroopers, the air mobile troops of the Russians and the naval infantry are still on the right bank of the Dnipro. So in this area mostly, they are still fighting. They are considered to be among the elites of the Russian troops. And there had been rumors that they would be withdrawn to save them, while mobilized men would be sacrificed to cover their retreat. We have now reports, also there are further reports about mobilized soldiers arriving, so they are definitely reinforcing that site. A full retreat cannot be said, but all of this makes it completely impossible to judge at the moment whether they want to continue fighting. It's possible within both ways that they evacuate administration and some logistics troops and then the elites to sacrifice mobilized soldiers, or that they continue fighting, that they want to fight for it while they send in mobilized people. What we do have now is increased confirmation about the Russians destroying boats along the river. We see here examples of boats being sunk. Those are pictures, the different kinds of boats that have been sunk, and all of that would make sense in the context of a Russian withdrawal, because while they still hold both sides, it kind of doesn't make too much sense to destroy the potential means of transportation. So that could be an indication of a withdrawal from the right bank of the Dnieper fairly soon, that they basically want to make sure in a hasty withdrawal they don't leave the means to the Ukrainians to cross the river after them. There are also reports about bridges being blown up over the inlets. There was specifically mentioned like a pedestrian bridge. All of those indications that they want to make it more difficult for the Ukrainians to follow them in case of a withdrawal. We also now have images of pillboxes being set up along Nova Kakhovka. Those are, I would not give too much on this description here, that it's pointless and that it's obsolete. For instance, when we see the positions here, it's clear that digging into the ground is impossible here, unless you want to blow up the whole wall along the front side. Any troops being dug in would not have an ability to fire in this direction, whereas now they are in fortified positions where they can guard the river, can shoot over it. Of course, those pillboxes will not withstand full hits with high calibers, and probably even a tank might destroy them with one single hit, but they are definitely a better protection if in case you want anti-tank crews or machine guns or anything like this to guard the river, to guard the bank of the river. For that, they are actually a very well proven and absolutely sufficient design to do this, even though the design obviously has weaknesses. Reinforced concrete of that thickness will likely be able to withstand sustained small arms fire, and that's more that the Russians can hope for in a position like this. So I would not dismiss the pillboxes being set up there like the poster on Twitter did here. We have also reports about massive troop movements on the right bank of the river. It's now confirmed that checkpoints have been evacuated, have been moved, but there are reports that the Russians are just reorganizing their troops, are redeploying them. We still don't have any serious proof of a Russian withdrawal over the river, even though we can interpret some things in this way. So I would not say it's sure that the Russians are withdrawing. It's far from sure at this point. In the whole area, we can see an increased usage by airplanes, both fixed wing as well as rotary wings. That is being interpreted in a way that it's an indication of the increased lack of artillery ammunition, that the Russians are being forced to use their aircraft to basically do the job of the artillery, as the artillery doesn't have the necessary ammunition anymore. Obviously, that also leads to more losses, which we have observed in the past few days. The deportations or evacuations, depending on which side you want to believe in this, are continuing. There are massive indications that big parts of the left bank of the river are also being evacuated, so the eastern part. This here, in these areas, even further north, above the Novakachovka Dam, we have reports of people being evacuated. The reasons there, we could speculate that they want to basically take away humans to make sure they don't fall back into Ukrainian hands. It could also mean that obviously they want to establish like a exclusive zone along the river to make sure civilians don't indicate where Russian troop concentrations are, as any civilian here might tell the Ukrainian armed forces where a good way to land troops is, in case the Ukrainians want to cross the river. It's a little too early to say that, but we do have the reports, the credible reports, that the Russians are keep moving people from this area. The Russians themselves are saying daily they are moving 1,200 civilian vehicles, cars, etc., and 5,000 people over the river. Those of you who have some knowledge in logistics can probably calculate the capacity for the ferries in this regard, which might be really helpful if you leave that in the comment, your calculation, when you thus calculate the possible traffic in the other direction when it comes to volume of supplies and reinforcements, because obviously a ferry will drive with supplies in this direction, and the other direction he might take civilians. Every time in this direction should mean additional ammo, etc. in this onto the right bank. So if one of you has the competence, unfortunately I don't have the knowledge for that, but if one of you has it and is able to explain and calculate for us how, to what degree that means the Russians are still able to supply their units, that would be really appreciated and helpful. The Russians are also, we have reports that the Russians are using martial law to force civilians to build constructions, and there are reports that the art museum of Kherson might be plundered, that they are removing art pieces. I have looked, I had image proof on Twitter. I saw images supposedly proving that, but the entry was deleted later. So to what degree that means that this might have been a fake or something, I cannot say. I've read several reports in this regard that supposedly the Russians are looting the art museum. I just can't confirm it with 100%, even though it seems kind of likely, just with some degree of uncertainty from my side. When it comes to military activity, we have the Russians saying they repulsed a ton of Ukrainian attacks more or less in that area, like they did in the last waves. And we have reports of massive Russian shelling on Pozad Pokrovska, which would indicate Ukrainian troop concentration here being attacked to prevent attacks in the direction of Kherson itself. That was it already from the front line, so more or less unchanged. Here the Ukrainians are still pushing but not advancing. Uncertain whether the Russians are withdrawing or not. It's both is possible. Kherson has the importance that it's, in my understanding, it would be a strategic target for the war. If the Russians lose it, they more or less lose hope to ever reach Odessa, which in my book is necessary to win the war for Russia, as this would mean control over the coast and thus control over Ukraine's economy, even after a potential ceasefire or after the war. Here along the front line, we don't have any reports about ground movements, and then from more or less Vuhledar, this time one report was a little to the west of it. I think Prechystivka, this town here, in that direction the Ukrainians reported an attack, but if we want to call it, let's summarize it with Vuhledar as well. So from the Vuhledar to Bilohorivka up here, the Russians are attacking. but not really much advancing, and they seem to waste big amounts of their mobilized reserves in those fruitless attacks that seem premature. North here, Ukrainians still have the initiative, but now in the Rasputitsa and in the current situation, they are currently not really advancing anymore. When we come to the mobilization, Putin has now said that 318,000 men were recruited because there have been additional volunteers. So according to him, during the mobilization, they were able to find 18,000 volunteers on top. And of those 318,000, 49,000 are already involved in fighting. He is now changing the rules for recruitment and mobilization without signing a decree to officially end the mobilization. That gives us the indication that the crypto mobilization will continue. And in fact, there are tons of reports from all over Russia about draft notices or mobilization notices still being handed out to reserves. So while Putin says the mobilization has ended, the reports on the ground say the opposite. We are also having reports about, still ongoing reports about continued lack of accommodation and equipment, and one of the changes in the law have been that he is changing how easy it is to recruit convicts. And I just looked up here a number about what degree we could even calculate as a potential for Russian criminals that are up for discussion, up for potential recruitment. And if we exclude 8.4% of women and 25% of the those that are not convicted yet, we have more or less 35%, if we round it up, 35% or 1/3 less of the total number. So those here should mean more or less 300,000 that are prisoners, that are male, and that are fully sentenced. In this regard, that shows a potential of what could be the pool of potential convict recruits that Russia is facing right now. There are the British Ministry of Defense is now saying Russia is using barrier troops and blocking units, and this should be something that is known to people who have watched the not too great movie Enemy Behind the Gates, in which you see Soviet troops in the Battle of Stalingrad shooting their own men if they are not advancing. According to the British Ministry of Defense, Russia is doing that now. They are actually, at least if we believe the British, they're actually using units now that are ordered to fire on their own comrades in case they don't advance or in case they retreat. Russia is also, I mean, the thing is, when we go back to that, deserting is a crime in basically every military, and deserting in a war is usually being punished really hard. But the fact that this seems to be, if we take the British Ministry of Defense for granted, if we believe what they say, that would mean that they are currently shooting their own men in case they don't advance enough, which would be a dramatic sign for the Russian morale and should mean a massive backslash on the home front once that becomes obvious. If somebody's telling the mother of a friend, your son was shot because he was too afraid to continue attacking and they shot him in the back, that should not be too productive when it comes to mobilizing the country. But we will see how well Russia's plan is progressing if the British Ministry of Defense is actually right here, because I have no way of confirming it myself. There are reports that Russia has increasingly bigger problems to replenish its material losses as well now. So not just the personnel, now we are reaching material problems. The British Ministry of Defense is saying in the middle of October, Russia was losing 40 armored vehicles per day, so tanks, IFVs, APCs, etc. And that's one of the reasons why they're negotiating with Belarus about handing over 100 armored vehicles. And at the same time, the Ukrainian General Staff is saying the Russians are now taking out equipment from depots without even doing proper maintenance anymore, which would then lead would allow us to expect that a lot of them will break down during offensive operations, which then will have again massive impact on morale and obviously on the combat effectiveness of the Russian units. There are now problems and complaints within Russia that especially in Volgograd, that mobilized men who have fallen are not being honored. So they're complaining that the government of Volgograd is not telling the public when mobilized men have fallen. They are giving them burials, but there is no mortuaries, I think is the word. I always forget that. Like when you put an ad in the newspaper saying somebody has died, they are not done, even though there are daily burials since October 28th. The government is not saying anything, so it's basically hiding the losses as of now. And on Twitter, we have a video that should be here exactly. We see, which is a unit which is soldiers from mobilized soldiers on the 252nd Motorized Guards Regiment, and they are refusing to fight and are asking to be sent back to Russia. As usual, you will be able to find the links to all of those on the website a few hours after the video has gone online, in case you want to look it up yourself and listen to it yourself. And while we also have some more news, there are reports about a military cadet academy, a military academy, now moving the graduation forward from June 2023 to December 2022 to fill up the Russian needs, which means those soldiers are now 6 months less educated than initially planned, which should reflect on their capabilities and knowledges. And at the same time, there are now the first voices saying that Russia should increase the duration of the draft from 1 year to 2 years to allow for better training, which in that context would just mean that they would be able to force the people to fight longer, as the indication isn't really leading towards increased training, but to massively less training and more reliance on human wave attacks. When we come to the political sphere, US intelligence agencies are saying that Iran is demanding Russian aid in gaining fission, radioactive material, and reactive fuel in exchange for its military aid for Russia. It is unclear as of now whether Russia is going to follow up on that and whether they are going to help. And it is unclear as of now for which kind of reactor we are talking about when it comes to the fuel, because obviously the type of reactor is essential to the question whether that fuel could be turned into nuclear weapons or material for nuclear weapons or not. So that is unclear now, but Iran seems to call on the Russians to help them. And obviously, as Russia is increasingly getting dependent on Iran, that gives Iran a better negotiation position in this regard. We have reports from Ukraine itself that the filtration measures are massively being increased. So filtration is, as it almost sounds, I think I'm actually not completely sure whether the Ukrainians or the Russians invented that word for it, but it means to filter the people. So they're to check through people to find out who is opposing the Russian government and then separate those people from the others. And obviously we hear the Ukrainian accusations all the time that they are at the very least disappearing and imprisoned, and often they are being found killed afterwards after they have been filtered out. And that is proven at least to a certain degree. Both this, and we also have further informations now that civilians in Svatove are being, the Ukrainian military intelligence is saying civilians in Svatove are being used as human shields by forcing children to keep going to school, even though the distance to the front line is, well, 13 kilometers, and they supposedly force civilians to go to work, to continue going to work. This is the right point to remind you, everyone who's new, that whenever an active participant in the war is saying something like this, we should take it with a grain of salt, because obviously both sides have a vested interest into shaping the informational battlefield into framing informations and into pushing us into some sympathy corridor, etc. That doesn't mean the GRU is wrong here. It wouldn't be the first war crime by the Russians, and the Ukrainian side has proven to be far more reliable than the Russian side in this war, but still we should keep informations like this with some skepticism and don't immediately take them for granted. The Ukrainian Resistance Center is also saying that the Russians are doing medical checks on children all over the occupied territory here, and if they are supposedly sick or ill, then they are being sent to recovery centers far off in the Russian Federation. And the Ukrainian Resistance Center is saying here that this is probably meant to force Ukrainian parents to follow their children into Russia to settle there, and thus basically increase the intended assimilation of Ukrainians into the Russian culture again. Another potential reason for that could also be, again, that the Russians are trying to get children separated to adopt them into Russian families. We have reports, and we have reports even from Russia about Ukrainian children being adopted by Russians. We cannot say how many of those were actually orphans or if some of them still had parents that were alive and were just stolen from them, but it's a potential reason for all of this as well. Whatever of either it is, whether it's meant to actually steal the children from their parents or to force the parents to move into Russia and thus dilute and basically get assimilated, either of which would be a clear violation of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So, in other words, either would be genocide. When it comes to support, we have rumors, fresh rumors, that the Russian embassy in North Korea has asked North Korea to supply clothing and boots. In the context of right now, it would obviously be winter clothing. We have had on this channel before some internet rumors that supposedly 1.5 million sets of winter clothing have disappeared out of storages. In that context, it kind of would make sense. So I guess in the context of all, it does make sense and it is credible. But I want to emphasize here, we're talking about a rumor. I don't see any confirmation, let alone a image proof or something like this. But I haven't even read it yet from any Western intelligence agency or something like this. So it might just be some usual Twitter, Telegram rumors that are baseless and invented by someone. But it would kind of make sense in the context, especially as we have increasing news that North Korea does actually supply artillery grenades to Russia. So if they already supply ammunition, why shouldn't they supply clothing? There are, according to the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, there are no ballistic missiles of Iran in Russia yet. But the 200 new drones, I think last time I said 300, but that was a mistake on my side. It's 200 drones. They are in delivery right now. And the 300 that were initially delivered are almost expended. According to the GUR, the Russians have signed a contract with Iran for an additional 1,500 to 2,400 Iranian drones. Iran is now admitting that they delivered drones to Russia, but they are now claiming, no, but that was before the war. Yeah. And we have news about Western aid. There is, the Americans are going to refurbish Hawk air defense missiles. I said it in the last report, that in the last situation report, that the Americans should have more or less 40,000 missiles in reserve. And the Hawk, while it's far from being competitive with the modern systems, it's more than sufficient to shoot down cruise missiles or cheap drones, especially if you're just using up stockpiles of air defense systems you are not going to use anymore. They are more or less the perfect choice for that, with a very good range while being dirt cheap, as they are more or less to be scrapped. So the US are supposedly refurbishing Hawk air defense missiles to supply them to Ukraine, which is getting a Hawk air defense batteries from Spain. And what this context didn't say, but which is obviously also possible, is that the US might also supply them with additional batteries. And then we have the report here that the Czech Republic is going to refurbish 90 T-72B tanks that are being paid for, where the refurbishment is being paid for by the Netherlands and the US. And those 90 tanks are to be given to the Ukrainian armed forces. The interesting part, though, is that we don't know to which level they are going to be modernized, but we have some indication. 90 tanks supposedly cost 90 million. And that's from what I read for refurbishment. If it's not to buy the tank, and it could be including the purchase, it almost seems more likely. But if it was just for modernization, that would mean they'd have a budget of 1 million euros or US dollars per tank, which would be incredibly much. It should give them more or less full new set of ERA, new ballistics computer, new guns, thermals, everything you can wish for is usually more or less covered in a tank like this with the sum, even though it seems more likely that it's meant to buy the tanks from a defense company, because that's where they currently are. If my understanding is correct, they are not part of the Czech military, and that would explain why it's T-72B as being said, because the Czech government never received T-72B. They received T-72M and M1. They modernized it themselves, they built them themselves, but they never received T-72B, which means a lot less armor. The A variant has a lot less armor, and the M variant is the export variant, which is more or less on the level of the A variant. But if it's with the defensive industry, it might mean that the industry has bought some former Soviet Union gear, for instance, from Moldova, from Ukraine a while ago, from Georgia, or wherever they might have bought them from a former country, that was former part of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, whatever it is, 90 tanks are to be modernized, and I think the delivery are supposed to be finished at the end of January. We see first tanks, some of the tanks will be available in December, and I read something that supposedly they are finishing in January, but that might be wrong. It might take a little longer, especially if the first theory is right, that they actually put 1 million just in modernizing equipment. That's not a modernization you do overnight. But nevertheless, 90 new tanks for Ukraine. Also, the US is going to supply 1,100 Phoenix Ghost drones, and they are going to supply 40 armored riverine boats. The exact type isn't perfectly clear, but as we can see on the map, there's a lot of water where armored boats might be really helpful. We have reservoirs here and so on and so forth. Mykolaiv, etc. on the southern Bug, it might also be used. In this regard, this is helpful for the Ukrainian side, and the US are going to refurbish and then deliver 250 M1117, so M1117. Those are 4x4 armored security vehicles. They are more or less APCs. They can have a turret on top that I think should at the very least be able to carry a heavy machine gun and an automatic grenade launcher, but they are not really IFVs, even though the Ukrainians will likely use them. 250 obviously means quite the mobility, and the armor of it should at least be good enough against splinters and light arms. So an additional help for Ukraine is coming. And then finally, we have some rumor, and I consider this with a big question mark, but supposedly Israel's government has now agreed to deliver weapons to Ukraine, but through other countries, by funneling them through other countries in response to the supposed help of Russia with the Iranian nuclear program. I am highly doubtful this is true at this very point. We will have to see until we have the first images of proof, the first proof of actual military aid to Ukraine by Israel. But I think Israel is in a not enviable position here, as it's absolutely dependent on Russian goodwill when it comes to the Middle Near East, the Middle East, the region there, as Russia has big influence on Syria and Iran, and can obviously, with its own military units in Syria, interfere with Israeli attacks on Iranian assets in Syria, and they could deliver high-grade air defense systems to Syria and Iran, and thus make future Israeli attacks on both countries really difficult. That's one of the reasons why Israel has stayed out of this conflict until now. That they suddenly change it seems kind of doubtful. What I said, in context of the potential Russian aid to an Iranian nuclear program, it would be understandable, but I intend to wait until I see it visually confirmed before I believe it. And finally, we have some more news that's not really to when it comes to military aid. Oh yeah, that was the other image. I have no idea yet to which degree they are going to be modernized. This is one of the versions, and a German journal about defense was showing this image. Pretty nice ERA, even though the hull doesn't seem to have received any additional armor. So I'm not completely sure which version the Czechs are going to deliver. And what we have here is a report from about a German now being caught by the Ukrainians. He was born in Dnipro in the Cold War of parents of German descent. They moved to Germany in the 90s. He lived in Germany for 17 years, and when the war in Ukraine started, he moved to Donbass to fight on the Russian side, and he was now captured by the Ukrainian side. And there we need to mention that the Ukrainians made a video of him showing himself like being the hard man, and then it cutting to him whimpering after being captured, which is a war crime. And it has to be said, dishonoring, presenting, parading prisoners of war is a war crime, even though it's obviously in a whole different level to systematic torture or something, but it's still a war crime and it should be mentioned. So this one has now been caught by the Ukrainians, and the German embassy is now in contact with the Ukrainians. So let's see what the German embassy is going to do with him. We have something here which is fairly interesting. It's a view of Ukrainian defensive positions where we can see how they are digging into the ground. You see with the staircase going deep underground, digging deep underground for positions in where the front line is fairly stable. Here we see the works here just to show to which degree the Ukrainians are digging in here. And then we have this here. This is, as far as I understood, a proposed new postage stamp in Ukraine. I'm not completely sure it's already confirmed. It might be. And it's the Ukrainians mocking the Russians, where you can see this is the scene from Titanic, which is a reference to the Russians saying the Crimean Bridge is undestroyable because the Titanic supposedly was unsinkable, and in the background you can see the explosion and the Crimean Bridge. So the Ukrainians mocking Russia again with a postage stamp like they've done a couple of times before in this war. Here we have an image of a video of support for Ukraine, where you can see the VAB. It's French, more or less like probably something closely similar to the M1117. So a 4x4 armored vehicle, more or less an APC or a recon car or something like this, but that can be used to transport troops and give them some fire support, even though it's not an IFV, but obviously massive help for the Ukrainians. And you can see the incredibly long line of those. So the French have delivered a lot of them to the Ukrainians, and it's kind of concerning to see the true concentration. So you have to hope they are far away from the front line and they're not actually stupid enough to stand like this in artillery range of the Russians or in drone attack range or something like this. But it shows the French help, and then we have some sad things that I found, and why not add a human component to this war. We have the Australian volunteer Trevor Kjeldal, who has fallen in the defense of Ukraine. This is his image, and he deserves to be mentioned in this context. We have the American Skylar James Greggs, 23-year-old, who has also fallen in Ukraine. He has already been wounded and returned to combat and gave his everything. And we have reports from Taiwan as well that a Taiwanese soldier who fought for Ukraine also died in defense of Ukraine. And while this is bad news, I want to finish up today's episode with something more positive. We have the image here of Azovstal defender Lev Pashko, who was released through a prisoner exchange, and during that release, at the end of the release, he asked his girlfriend to marry him, and they have now married. So at least something positive at the end of this episode about a brutal war. That was it for now. I hope it was interesting for you. I usually say I hope you enjoyed it, but kind of like images like this are probably not that enjoyable. I hope it was interesting for you. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. I want to thank everyone who's already supporting the channel, and if you also want to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much for everyone, but you can also support the channel by a thumbs up. Let me know what you think about the current development. Do you think Russia can claim back the overall strategic initiative, or do you think the Ukrainians will actually win this war, depending on the support of the West? Obviously, any discussion in this should be highly interesting, and at the same time it obviously helps with the algorithm, where every activity in the comment section is really boosting up the channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. I made 2 more videos that are going to be published in the next few days about the nuclear weapons and Russia's use of the refugee weapon. They're going to be published outside of the regular intervals of situation reports. I hope you don't want to miss them, and I want to invite you to watch them. And if you want to help the channel grow, recommend it to your friends and acquaintances to help make it grow. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.